Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm talking about all of the books that I read in the month of January 2023, and it was a very good reading month for the first month of the year when I was diving into a lot of the different challenges and goals that I set for myself. And I read several books from Book of the Month, which is one of the challenges that I'm working on this year, and also finished all the books in my alphabet challenge. So without further ado, let's dive into the books that I was able to read in January. So the first book that I read is actually a book that belongs more in October because it was very creepy, and that is What Lies Between Us by John Marrs. I've been on a bit of a John Marrs kick because he has a new book coming out, and I've really enjoyed other books that he's written in the past. This one was super, super creepy. It's the creepiest book of his that I've read thus far. It's basically about two women that live in a house together, and we're not entirely sure why they're living in this house together, but one of them is basically trapping the other one in the house. And we don't know much about them in the beginning, but we kind of learn of their backstories as the book goes on. And it's kind of a horrible situation about why these two women are living in this house together. And I don't want to give a ton away, but I will just say that this is a book that belongs in October. Very creepy. The ending is also, it's just creepy all around. I'll just say that. So if you like creepy books, if you like things like psychological suspense, this would be a book to pick up. Next, I was able to finish a book that I had actually started in December, which is Kristen Hanna's Night Road. This has been a book on my list for a really long time. I was working my way through Kristen Hanna's backlist. I have a ton left of her backlist to read. But this is the story of a family and a couple of teenagers in this family who befriend this girl, and eventually she becomes like a dear friend of their family. And then there is an accident, a car accident, and of course there is fallout from that car accident. And this is very much kind of like a family drama in that we're seeing over the course of several years the actions of that night of the accident kind of playing out over time. I actually really liked this book. I liked how the setup happened. I liked what happened with the characters and kind of their emotions about the accident. And I liked how it eventually resolved as well. So definitely we'll be picking up more Kristen Hanna in the future. I also read the first couple books actually in Dee Henderson's Evie Blackwell Cold Case series. The first one is called Traces of Guilt. And this is a book that I really enjoyed. It covers this group of law enforcement officers that come together to solve cold cases. And it's kind of a new group that is coming together to do that. And what was actually like a really pleasant surprise is that there were characters from Dee Henderson's other series that show up in this series. And I was not expecting that. And I really like her other series. And so I was like, oh, this is so pleasant to like revisit, you know, these people. And the way that this is set up is that a couple of the characters are kind of working together in the same physical location, but they're working on different cases. And I really liked the setup of this book. I liked the structure of it. Where it eventually goes and how it kind of pulls in other characters was really interesting. And then the second one is called Threads of Suspicion, and it's in a different physical location and also the same kind of deal, like trying to solve multiple crimes. And I just really like the two books in this series. Now I'm a little nervous that there aren't going to be any more books in this series because I think the second one in the series came out a while ago. It's definitely setting itself up for more books, and I would love to see more books with these characters. But anyway, really, really enjoyed Dee Henderson and really enjoyed those first two books in that series. Next up, I read a book called The Two Lives of Lydia Bird by Josie Silver. This is one of the Book of the Month books that I read. And I had read Josie Silver in the past and enjoyed the book that I read by her. And so I picked this up just because I liked her as an author. And the general story is about a woman who loses her partner and then kind of alternates back and forth in realities to where she's still with her partner and then she is like moving on in her life. And it's a really kind of wonderful story about just like grieving and how do you kind of choose to move on, you know, at a certain point when your future in front of you looks very different than what you had hoped for. So I really enjoyed that one as well. Also finished A Cosmic Kind of Love by Samantha Young. This is a book that I had also started in December and continued into January. And this is a fun romance about a party organizer, like a party planner and an astronaut. and they end up meeting through kind of a funny circumstance and then begin to have a relationship. Also a great book about kind of like your family liking or not liking your choices, and kind of like how do you respond to that, and then how do you also create like a chosen family for yourself as an adult. I thought it was really charming, so I like that one a lot too. Then I picked up Since We Fell by Dennis Lehane. I'm always a huge Dennis Lehane fan. This is one of his standalones. I believe it's also one of the Book of Month Club books. And this one was a little odd. Like there are kind of these things that are happening with characters that make the characters a little unreliable, which I don't mind that at all. But I think that kind of how this book ended up unfolding, like there were just a lot of things I wasn't expecting, and that I felt like were kind of interesting aspects for Dennis Lehane to kind of bring into the storyline. I don't want to go into too much detail actually, because like there's a lot of stuff that I'm trying to remember, like even when it happens in the book, and like what would be a spoiler and what would not be a spoiler. I did listen to this on audio. I think it might be easier to follow if I had had a physical copy as well. Like I had an ebook, but I wasn't really looking at the ebook. I was just listening to it. And I liked it. I'm like trying to remember back now because it was one of the earlier books in the month. I like the book. I don't know that I would pick it up again. And I like some of Dennis Lehane's other mystery books more, and I would definitely reread those again. Then I picked up a very, very charming romance called Only When It's Us by Chloe Leese. This is one of the first books in the Bergman Brothers romance series. And it tells the story of a female soccer player who's in college. She plays for UCLA, and her romantic partner, who's the person who eventually becomes her romantic partner, who is a student in college who also happens to be hard of hearing. He's also a former soccer player, but through getting, I think it's like meningitis, he ends up losing his hearing and having some pretty severe hearing loss that he's having to kind of deal with as an adult who's losing his hearing. And they end up in a romance together. And I did not know this until after I had read this book, but this author writes romances that often include some form of like disability or neurodiversity. And she kind of describes herself as an author who writes romances for people who normally don't get romances. And I think that's really charming. So I was really drawn to that. I've already picked up a bunch of other books in the series and would highly, highly recommend that one. Okay, then I picked up The Marriage Game by Sarah Desai. This is the first book in the Marriage Game series. And I picked this up because I actually wanted to read the second book in this series, which is the Book of the Month Club book. And I hadn't read the first book, so I wanted to go in order. I didn't get to the second book this month, but I was able to read this one. And this is basically a story about a woman who is coming out of a culture of arranged marriages, and her father has kind of chosen these people for her to interview for arranged marriages. And in the midst of doing that, she happens to meet this person who is kind of set up as like an enemy of her family. It's kind of an enemies to lovers romance novel. And I will say I'm interested in reading the second book in this series because this will sound like an odd reason why, like I wasn't like super sucked into the first book, but sometimes the first book is like a pilot for a TV show. Like it's not the greatest book in the series, like they get better over time. I was intrigued enough, especially about kind of some of the cultural components that were discussed in this book, that I would want to keep going and kind of see what else the series has to offer. So I would say if you read this and you're like, maybe it's not for me, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to see if there's something else in this series that's kind of interesting to me. I figure if the second book was picked up by Book of the Month, there's got to be something there, even if the first one wasn't, you know, like really sucking me in. Okay, then I picked up and listened to on audio, and I had it in physical form from my library, a book called Widowland by C.J. Carey. This is an alternative history novel that is basically one of those alternative histories that World War II doesn't go kind of the way that it did go. And so you still have Hitler alive and as a political actor in this book. And you have these different categories of women that are like in different social spaces in culture. So some women are kind of highly revered if they have certain characteristics and certain kinds of roles within society, and others are less revered. And there is a woman who is kind of navigating in this space as a single woman, but is getting kind of pressured to get married and start a family. And she ends up getting kind of connected to a couple of parties, again, I'm trying not to give away anything too important. She ends up kind of getting connected to other characters who represent both kind of the traditional side of this society and also a more non-traditional side of the society. I really like revisionist history. I think it's interesting. I feel like it's always interesting to explore like what could have been when it comes to different historical events. I really liked how it ended. So I think that I would definitely recommend this one. And I found it to be really interesting. All right, I also read the first couple of books in the Kay Scarpetta series by Patricia Cornwell. The first one is called Postmortem. And this is one of the challenges I set for myself this year, to read all the books in this series. There's about 26 right now. And I haven't read these in a long time. It's probably been at least 10 years since I picked up these books. And they're a little bit dated. This should not surprise anyone. I think the early ones were written in like the early 90s. And actually I can look and see. This is a re-released one, so that's not gonna be the right date. But as you can imagine, like these were some of the earliest books talking about forensic science in terms of solving crimes. And so the science early on was, I mean, like this was like cutting edge when the book was coming out. Now we see it all the time on TV shows, CSI, crime solving shows. And, but I also really kind of want to honor like the timing of when this was written. Like it doesn't bother me that some of these things feel a little bit dated. And I really like the storyline where basically you have somebody who is doing that kind of forensic work as a coroner and partnering with the police to kind of solve these crimes. So the first two books are really along that line. Like there's different crimes, there's different things that are happening, but there's some kind of special thing in the crime where forensics is really allowing Kay Scarpetta, who's the coroner, to be contributing to the medical examiner side of solving these crimes. The second book in that series is called Body of Evidence. And again, totally different crime. Same set of characters. Kay Scarpetta is working with, I think his name is Pete Marino. He's like a detective in the series. And of course, Kay Scarpetta is kind of put in danger, you know, in a couple of times in these books. It's a little bit formulaic, but I feel like the books get better as they go. And so it's like just an early investment in the series to go back to the beginning. I also picked up this past month a book called The Burnout Epidemic, The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It by Jennifer Moss. This is a book that I really appreciated. I read it on audio, and I had a physical copy of this as well from the library. I really appreciated that the author goes into a lot of like infrastructural problems in the workplace that are causing people to feel burnout. So she really focuses on, it's not like the surface level solutions for burnout. It's a lot of things about how you set up work for people and how you kind of are careful about the loads that people are carrying at work. And it goes into, I think, deeper solutioning than what we would see in kind of like a short form article about like take a vacation or, you know, like, I mean, it really is trying to get at some of the more systemic issues that come up in the workplace around burnout. I think if you're kind of new to the topic of burnout or you're trying to kind of do a deeper dive, this is a great book to start that kind of outlines a lot of the issues and the scholarship and the literature around this topic. Then I picked up a book called Frozen Beauty by Lexa Hillier. I've never read this author before, but I saw somebody talking about this book on social media and it just looked kind of interesting to me. This is a book that is young adult and it's about a few teenagers who are like good friends and then one of them is found dead. And she's kind of died of hypothermia. This is not giving anything away, but she's outside when she's found dead. And one of the other teenagers is arrested for this crime. And there's quite a bit that is kind of unfolding in this story. Like as you go along, you kind of course, come to understand like the circumstances around her being outside and like what happened. I would say that I felt like the tropes of this book were relatively, what's the word I'm looking for? Unsurprising. Like I where this book kind of ended up, I was like, yep, like that's a lot of the storylines around kind of, you know, teens these days and like the kinds of issues that they're having. Like there wasn't anything unique about this story. I did like the way that it was told in terms of some of the alternating narration. There was some poetry of one of the characters that was kind of brought into the story, which I thought was kind of fun. And I did read this book in pretty much one sitting, so it's not that it didn't hold my attention, but I didn't see anything that was particularly unique about it other than kind of the structure in which it was told. So I enjoyed it. Okay, then I picked up a book called The Love of My Life by Rosie Walsh. This is another book that I totally got influenced on from somebody talking about it on social media. My library had it, I checked it out, and like immediately was able to read it. It's a book about a woman who has kind of a hidden identity, and she's married to someone who writes obituaries, and she has an illness at one point, and so he starts to kind of prepare an obituary for her. And as he digs into her life, he realizes there's a lot he doesn't know, and there's a lot that she's kind of hidden from him. And this is one of those stories that also kind of unfolds as you go. There's quite a bit that you as a reader don't understand about how these different characters are tied together. I would definitely put this under psychological suspense, but when I was reading reviews for this book after I had finished it, I agreed with a lot of the reviews that said this book seemed kind of confusing about what genre it was in. Like, it was a psychological suspense, but it was almost kind of women's literature as well. And then there was kind of like some family drama. Like, I mean, it was kind of an interesting mishmash of like all these different kinds of subgenres. And some people didn't like that. I thought it was fine. I mean, this is not a book that I think a year from now will like really stand out to me. But in the moment, like when I was reading it, I found it interesting and kind of wanted to see what was going to happen. I also picked up a book called Things We Do in the Dark by Jennifer Hillier. This is a book I've seen a lot of people talking about. Definitely falls into my typical genre that I read about mystery and suspense. This is a story about a woman, kind of two different storylines that are happening in parallel, and then they kind of converge partway through the book. One of them is a woman who is found in her house, and her partner has died, and she has like his blood on her, and she's arrested for this crime. And then there's kind of another storyline of a woman who's getting out of prison, and she is a killer, and there's a podcaster who's like going to visit her, and he wants to kind of understand her story because he knew her daughter who died. And so we're kind of like seeing these different stories happening in parallel, and then in the middle we understand how they're connected. I thought this was actually a really interesting book about overcoming or dealing with trauma from childhood. And there are several trigger warnings I would offer for this book. Child abuse, child sexual abuse, that I think are important to note. Suicide is another trigger warning. But I don't feel like any of those things are gone into in extreme detail. A lot of things are more implied. And it's not a book that I think is incredibly like psychologically dark. It does have dark themes. I actually enjoyed this. I like this author. I've read several things by her. I plan to read other books in her backlist as well, and would definitely recommend this one also. Okay, then I picked up a book called Black Chalk by Christopher Yates. This was one of my Alphabet Challenge books this month. And I will just say I listened to this on audio. I had it on ebook. I didn't feel like I knew what was going on for like 75% of this book. I did go online and try to understand a plot summary. And sometimes I'll do this just to kind of give myself a sense of what's going on. Like, I don't want to ruin the book for myself, but if I'm kind of lost, it's like, what is the point? Like, I just don't really understand. So there's a large portion of this book where I was like, what is happening here? And I just was not following it very well. And so I went online and found out a little bit about what I was expecting to kind of happen. And basically it's dark academia. It's a group of students who, when they are in college, play this game that's kind of like this psychological game, but the game is never described very well. And so I think that's part of the confusion, is you're just having to kind of like release that. Like, it's not something you're going to know all the details about. And then what ends up happening is many, many years later, a couple of these people come back together to like finish the game. And that's like the last 25% of the book where you actually understand what's going on. It's interesting because when I went to kind of look around and read reviews and like try to figure out what was going on, I felt like no one was really talking about the actual plot points of this book. And I was like, does everyone also not understand what's going on in this book? Because people would say things like, well, I don't want to ruin it and I don't want to like give too much away. And I'm like, I'm not sure anyone really understands what's going on in this book until like the last 25%. The last 25%, however, was very satisfying. So this is a hard one for me. It's like, if you're willing to be kind of confused for the first part and then kind of get resolution in the end, maybe it's worth it. I think this would actually be a good book to like adapt into a TV show or film. Maybe it already has been, I don't know. But I did find that I found it kind of funny. I think it's kind of rare that I would read a book that I would get that far into it and not really understand. I don't often DNF books, do not finish books. This is one that I might have done that if it hadn't been an alphabet challenge book, but I'm glad that I kind of pushed through and figured out what was going on at the end of that book. Okay, then I picked up a book of essays by John Green called The Anthropocene Reviewed. And this is, I think, John Green's first kind of foray into nonfiction. He is most known for his YA novels, such as The Fault in Our Stars, which was a very popular one that was adapted into a film. I have read every novel by John Green with the exception of one, which is his most recent, which I would like to read, hopefully this year. And I thought these essays were lovely. They are based on a podcast that he did where this is kind of his way of processing the pandemic. Like he talks quite a bit about topics related to the pandemic, but it's basically a range of random topics that he's kind of reviewing and grading on a 5-star scale that are just things in the world, like random things that he's talking about. Like Diet Dr. Pepper is one example. And the stories are really charming. I think what is really interesting about John Green as he's going into this nonfiction space, and he does this in his fiction worlds as well, is he's very open about dealing with topics of mental illness. John Green identifies as being OCD and various other forms of mental illness, and talks about it pretty openly in these essays. And I always find that refreshing and also interesting. Would highly recommend. I did not get a chance to listen to any of the podcast episodes, so I'm not sure how closely they follow the essays, but that might be another way of kind of entering in and experiencing his work in that space. The next book I read because John Green mentioned Amy Rosenthal in his essay. And Amy Rosenthal is another writer who died, it wasn't super recently, several years ago. And her husband became very well known because Amy Rosenthal wrote an essay in the New York Times that was basically about, maybe you might want to marry my husband. It was kind of like a love letter to her husband as she was dying. And so her husband ended up writing this memoir called My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me. And John Green mentioned Amy Rosenthal just being his friend, you know, in this book of essays. And it reminded me of this other book by her husband, which I happen to own. And so I decided to read it. And it's a really wonderful memoir about their relationship and kind of her final days and kind of how he then picked up and kind of kept going, you know, after they had this, you know, lengthy marriage and relationship, and they have several children and they have a very close-knit family. And then she dies and they have to kind of keep going. And very short memoir, quick read. I think I read it in a couple of days, but a very kind of bittersweet, you know, set of stories about his relationship with her. And I have loved her work. She has a couple of wonderful kind of memoir-esque books that I've really enjoyed. So highly recommend his memoir as well as her books as well. Okay, then I also picked up a book called How to Live a Good Life by Jonathan Fields. This is like a series of essays about things that you can incorporate into your life to create more happiness and positivity. I just kind of dipped in and out of this. I thought it was packaged well in terms of kind of the themes that the author talks about. I don't really feel like it was super memorable in terms of what I was taking away, but I really enjoy Jonathan Fields' work in the interviews that he does in his podcast, which is called The Good Life Project. And so it was just interesting to kind of read one of his books. He has another book that recently came out called Sparked, which I also have but have not read yet. And so look forward to reading more from him. Okay, then I read a book called The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This is a book that's been on my list for a really long time because it's a romance that takes place in academia, and especially in like a STEM field where you have a graduate student and a professor who are in a fake dating relationship. I really liked this story. I feel like they handled the graduate student and professor being in a relationship pretty well, because there is a point where they like check with HR on it, which I think is actually important in this kind of storyline. And the fake dating trope, I think, is always kind of fun. And overall, I really liked it. I would definitely read other books by this author. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend that one too. Okay, the last 4 books I read of the month are all my alphabet challenge books. Somehow these all got left till the end of the month. So then I read Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. 5-star read. I would highly recommend this. I've been talking about it with like everyone. I've recommended it to my partner. I've recommended it to multiple people. I find it fascinating. There are so many things I learned in this book that I was just like, I had no idea. And it has changed like some actions that I'm taking like around breathing already. I would definitely read it again. I ended up getting it on audio. I have this book on audio, ebook, and in a hard copy that I own. Really, really enjoyed it. I am kind of sad that I put off reading it for so long. So if this is one that's kind of been on your radar, you should definitely pick it up. One of the things that this author does is he does some experiments on himself related to his breathing, including plugging up his nose for 10 days and only mouth breathing. And the results are fascinating. Like there's so many things that he brings into this book that I just found so interesting. And it's a very memorable set of studies that he talks about. So highly, highly recommend that one. Then I read Big Brother by Lionel Shriver, and wow, Lionel Shriver knows how to talk about really uncomfortable things and continue to make them really uncomfortable in how she talks about them. So this is a book about a adult pair of siblings, a woman and her brother, and her brother has kind of fallen on hard times and he's going to come visit her and kind of live with her and her family for a little while. And when he arrives, she realizes that he has gained a significant amount of weight. And she did not know that that had happened. And she is very concerned that he's kind of eating his feelings and that this is like really not a healthy way of dealing with whatever it is, you know, that's kind of coming out of his past that's causing him to have this weight gain. One of the themes of this book, and I actually, like, I was thinking like, how am I going to talk about this book? Because I think that there are a lot of very like fat positive, both fiction and nonfiction contributions like out in the world. And I think they're very important. And this book does kind of focus on some themes of like health and even like disgust of people who are engaging with people who are morbidly obese. So it's not an easy read, like, and none of Lionel Shriver's things ever are. I mean, the things I've read of hers are difficult. Like, this is just kind of what she's known for, and at least in my mind, is she kind of tackles these things that are very kind of difficult or uncomfortable. But I think she does it really well from like a craft perspective. Like, I'm not going to say the perspective in this book are all things that I agree with, but the way that she kind of raises and talks about social perspectives is usually pretty right on. Like, I mean, she's very good in terms of being just an exceptional writer. I mean, every time I read her books, I'm blown away by what she's able to do. So I think that this book, what I will say is there's like a part 1 and a part 2, and I think a part 3. The shift that happens between part 1 and part 2, I did not see coming. Like, I was just like, oh, where is this going? Like, I mean, the part 1 where the siblings are kind of reunited was like, yep, this is what's happening. But like, in terms of where the plot was going, it was really hard for me to kind of understand where it was headed. And then when I saw part 2, I was like, huh. I mean, I was really sucked in. I did want to know what was going to happen. I'd listened to this on audio and enjoyed it on audio. So I would just say go into Lionel Shriver's books knowing that they're not always easy reads. I think that they're meaningful and kind of useful cultural commentaries. And you may not always agree with kind of how she's approaching things, but I think the craft of how she does it is really well done. Okay, then I picked up both Flesh and Not essays by David Foster Wallace. I think David Foster Wallace is a brilliant, brilliant man, or was a brilliant, brilliant man, because he died. But there are so many things he writes that are just completely over my head. And this is a good example. Like, he does a lot of literary criticism in this book. There's a little bit of cultural criticism, which I tend to find his cultural criticism a little bit easier to digest and kind of connect with. Some of the literary stuff he talks about is just very obscure. And I can tell that he's brilliant when I'm reading it. I don't always understand exactly what he's saying. And especially when he's talking about obscure things that I've never read or I don't know anything about what they are. So I will admit, some of these essays I skimmed. I was kind of looking for the stuff that I could connect with and find interesting. He has another book of essays called Consider the Lobster, which I have found easier to kind of connect with and that I find a little bit more interesting. So I would say if you're into literary criticism and like really kind of high culture criticism, this would be of interest to you. But for the majority of people, probably not a fit. And I say that as an English major. So I'm used to reading a lot of theoretical stuff, and this one was a little bit harder and more obscure. And the final book that I read at the end of this month is called The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood. I will say Margaret Atwood is not as obscure as David Foster Wallace, in my opinion. However, I would put her in this category of just like complete brilliancy, and you're not always going to completely understand what's going on in her books. I listened to this on audio. I was reading it on ebook as I was going through it because it is basically a story that has a story inside of it, and then there's a third story inside of that at one point in the book, and there's a lot to juggle. There's kind of a set of circumstances that are kind of portrayed in the beginning of the book that you find out towards the end of the book are not actually what's happening. And so it is kind of a mystery that you're trying to unravel as you're reading. But I also just found you kind of just have to go with the flow on this one and like see how it comes out in the end. Towards the beginning, I acknowledge I did go on Wikipedia to try to understand what was going on with this plot, because I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to fully appreciate the end of this book if I don't understand where it's going and like what she's trying to do. Some people would say that's cheating. I acknowledge that I cheat with some of these books because I would like to kind of understand the mechanics of what Margaret Atwood is doing in this book, and that's more important to me than the plot. I think that Margaret Atwood is very experimental in what she tries to do. She has such a range of different kinds of books that she's written. I think obviously The Handmaid's Tale is one of her more popular ones. And so it was really fun to kind of look at some of the things that she is bringing into this book from, again, like a mechanics perspective. And I enjoyed it. I don't know that I would read it again. It's a longer book. I think it's over 500 pages. But I'm glad that I read it, and I would definitely read other books in Margaret Atwood's backlist because I think that her range is just really impressive. So those are the 25 books that I was able to read in the month of January. A wonderful reading month, and so fun to dive into a ton of like different genres and books that have been in backlists for a long time, and I finally got around to reading them. Keep an eye out for my February TBR video that's coming out soon. And until then, happy reading.